army of tens of thousands. Before October 7th, Iran had a supreme leader named Khomeini. Today, Iran has a supreme leader named Khomeini. The speech went on for some time, but clearly Lapid's argument has merit. Fan House has described this as strategic fatigue. The public still broadly supports the war's objectives, but has lost faith in the government's ability to convert military operations into anything resembling a lasting resolution. And that gap is when Netanyahu's domestic position started to crack. On Sunday evening, Lapid himself stood alongside former Prime Minister Naftali Bennett on a stage in Herzliya and announced that they had merged their parties into a single list called Together ahead of the upcoming elections in October. Netanyahu is in a fragile enough coalition as it is, one that was finally reached after the country went through a staggering 5 elections in 4 years. And that coalition is starting to show cracks as well. Last weekend, the Israeli High Court issued a sweeping enforcement ruling on the issue of drafting Haredi Jews or the so-called ultra-Orthodox into the military. They generally view this as violating core tenets of their faith, and because of that, Haredi men have been exempt from the country's conscription since the country's founding. As that works when there are a tiny fraction of the population, but the numbers have exploded over the last 2 decades. And given the multi-front war and an estimated 17,000 soldier shortage in the IDF, this has become a serious issue in Israeli politics. The problem for Netanyahu is that his coalition depends on the support of the Shas party, which represents Haredim, and has made it clear that the draft exemption is an issue as they will not be. Another Haredi party, United Torah Judaism, actually quit the coalition last year over precisely this issue, leaving Netanyahu with a minority government. Now, none of this means that Netanyahu is finished. Some version of the end of his political career has been written every time he's faced a crisis at home, and yet he has always managed to return. One of these issues plaguing the opposition is how little they agree on once they get past the issue of getting Netanyahu out of office, which is precisely what led to his revival after losing premiership for a brief stint in 2021. Nearly 3 years on from October 7th, the Middle East has a lot of new scars. What it doesn't have, at least not yet, is a real peace deal. This upcoming week could be the first test to see if one is actually possible, or whether the region is destined to collapse back into endless bloodshed. Thank you for watching. According to the Wall Street Journal, some Trump administration officials have privately assessed that the United States could no longer fully execute its contingency plans to defend Taiwan. And no, that's not because it's anything China did, rather it's because of what just got fired off in the Persian Gulf. In a few weeks of war with Iran, the United States and its allies burned through more interceptors than the entire global production base can replace in years. The systems that are supposed to protect cities from incoming missiles in Seoul, in Riyadh, in Tel Aviv, across nearly 2,000 countries, all run on the same American supply chain. And that supply chain was already struggling before the Middle East tried to help. For most of the last 3 decades, missile defense has been one of those things that has quietly worked. The reason skyscrapers kept going up in places that sit within range of people who rather they didn't. What happens when the ammunition runs out? It's a question that until very recently, nobody seriously had to ask. Fast forward to today, and things are more than just serious. For the first time in a long time, American allies are faced with the very real possibility that should a vast war break out, they might be unable to properly defend themselves. By the time the ceasefire between the United States, Israel, and Iran came into effect on April the 8th, Washington had fired somewhere between 1,000 and 1,430 of its Patriot defense interceptors of Iranian missiles and drones inbound toward countries across the Gulf and beyond, estimated to be roughly half of its pre-war stockpile. Patriot is the most well-known of these systems, but it's just one layer of a broader ecosystem, one that the US and its allies rely on to shoot down incoming threats of various altitudes and speeds. Across other interceptor categories, the picture was broadly similar or even worse. A recent breakdown by the Center for Strategic and International Studies puts US expenditure of Thor at somewhere between 190 and 290 launched out of a pre-war inventory of just 360. At the upper bounds of their analysis, that means roughly 80% have gone. SM-3 interceptors fared similarly, with more than 30% of the pre-war stockpile expended, and SM-6 stocks were drawn down by another 10 to 20% of that. This gets even worse when you look at the Gulf states themselves, which have been absorbing most of the incoming fire. The UAE, which was on the receiving end of nearly half of all Iranian strikes, and burned through roughly 3/4 of its entire intercept stockpile. Saudi Arabia and Bahrain, meanwhile, were north of 85%, as an estimate by Bloomberg stated that Qatar was, at one point, just 4 days from running dry. The Pentagon and the White House have both closed ranks to insist that they have more than enough to last out whatever Iran may throw at the region, and there is reason to believe that they are telling the truth here. Concerns in the early days of the war about the Gulf monarchies completely running dry were rendered more or less moot as airstrikes were able to bring down the rate of Iranian launches by an estimated 90% by the end of the first month. But finishing this war, whatever that may mean at this point, is completely different from being ready for the next one. These stockpiles were not full to begin with the US already having transferred more than 600 Patriot interceptors to Ukraine and other allied nations since 2022. A drawdown that was quietly getting attention in Washington. It was last summer's 12-day war codenamed Operation Rising Lion that turned that attention into genuine alarm. In order to block Iranian missiles during that conflict, the US launched roughly 150 Thor interceptors, roughly a quarter of Washington's entire supply, along with another 80 standard missile interceptors. By the time Epic Fury started 8 months later, not a single one of them had been replaced. So at this point, it is pretty clear that the US, and by extension, most of its allies, are in tough shape in terms of current supplies. The question then is how fast can they build more? And it's here that things go from concerning to downright terrifying. These things are not just thrown together on an assembly line in an afternoon. Each one is a high-tech guided missile in its own right with components that take over a year to manufacture from start to finish. Currently, the US only domestically produces 50 or so Patriot interceptors a month. For some context, US forces fire around 400 in the first 16 days of Epic Fury alone, consuming in less than a month what the production line puts out in roughly 8. Thor is worse. According to CSIS's Wes Rumbach, no new Thor interceptors have been delivered to US inventory since July 2023, a 30-month production gap that predates the war entirely, and even now production sits under 100 a year. At that rate, replacing just the interceptors expended in Epic Fury takes 3 years, assuming more don't get fired off in the meantime. Part of this comes down to budget priorities and political will. For most of the Cold War period, missile defenses were built around a different threat model entirely. A small number of high-end ballistic missiles in a brief, decisive exchange with interceptors as a last resort. Some of these systems, like Patriot, actually date back to the 1970s when the concern was about stopping an all-out Soviet strike. The kind of drone and missile barrage that has come to define every Middle East conflict, not to mention the skies over Ukraine, simply wasn't on anyone's radar. But even once the political will is found, that only clears one hole. You still have to find companies with both the facilities and the sophistication to build these systems, and the industrial base that's supposed to do it has been hollowed out for decades. Propellant systems that make these missiles fly are now produced by just 2 American companies, down from 6, and both of them share suppliers and depend on a single source for one of the key chemicals the propellant needs to ignite. In spite of all of this, Washington has been trying to ramp up production since well before Epic Fury kicked off. The Pentagon signed multiple framework agreements earlier this year, targeting 3 or 4 times current output across every major interceptor category, oversaw the groundbreaking on a new munitions factory in Arkansas in January, and brokered a $500 million deal with Honeywell to surge component production. Even still, this is going to be a massive uphill battle, one that's realistically looking at end-of-decade timelines, not the next few months. Given just how tight supplies have gotten, officials have reportedly been calling on companies from GM to Ford to GE to discuss converting civilian manufacturing plants into at least partial missile component production facilities. By all accounts, it was the first time Washington had asked automakers to consider retooling for munitions since the Second World War, and that fact, more than anything else, probably tells you everything you need to know about how the people running this privately understand the hole they're in. Now, before we get into that hole, I guess, just a quick word about our new subscriber site, fronts.co, which is the home for bonus in-depth content from fronts, war fronts, and home fronts. And every week, we publish 2 exclusive videos and at least 2 expert-written articles getting into the nitty-gritty of the conflicts shaping our world. Basically, if war fronts is for the informed layman, fronts is for the conflict nerds who always get a little geekier than we can afford to hear on the main channel. So, for example, we have our weekly 90-minute podcast on all things Middle East, articles written by experts on things like the limitations of turtle tanks, plus our weekly briefing room videos to fill you in on all the obscure wars flying under the media's radar. But not ours. If you like what we do here and would love to see us get into more depth, fronts.co is the place for you. It costs just $5 a month or $50 a year. And now, let's get back to that hole we were going to get into. Shopping elsewhere. Now, if you're watching this from outside the United States or the Middle East, you might be thinking that none of this is really your problem. Unfortunately, it very much is. Somewhere around 2,000 countries are running their primary missile defense on US-made interceptors right now, and outside of Japan, where Mitsubishi licensed builds Patriots under a decades-old arrangement, every major US-aligned air defense architecture in the world depends on a supply chain that largely runs through Arkansas, Arizona, and Alabama. For those countries, there's no second source. Washington comes up short, and, well, in short, stay off. During Epic Fury, that arrangement has been stress tested, and the results are, put mildly, not really reassuring. As many as 48 Thor interceptors were reportedly pulled from South Korea and moved to the Middle East back in March. And while Seoul almost certainly did everything in its power to fight that move, as President Lee Jae-myung said in a cabinet meeting on March the 10th, quoting, "While we express opposition, the reality is that we cannot fully impose our position." And these countries, like South Korea, will be the obvious question. If you can't count on Washington to lead your interceptors where they are, who else can you buy from? And to be fair, there are some alternative options out there. They just don't have a track record that you really want to bet your country's defense on. Iran built just about its entire air defense architecture around Russia's S-300 system, which Moscow has exported to some 20 countries over the last few decades, including Venezuela. We'll let you fill in the gaps on how well they held up. More recently, Iran also attempted to develop its own domestic system, the VAR 373, and it hasn't fared much better, although Iran has claimed down in the US F-55 jet in early April. Russia does have an updated, modernized version, the S-400, which they swear is the real deal this time, they promise. While it has outperformed the S-300, this is largely by clearing what is quite possibly the lowest threshold imaginable, and not exactly doing it by much either. It's been deployed to front against Ukraine, where they destroy multiple batteries and fly both drones and Storm Shadow cruise missiles through S-400 coverage zones, often without issue. India is perhaps the outlier here. They've also relied heavily on Russian hardware, and claimed that the system held up well against the Pakistani military last year. China's main export offering, the HQ-9, has a similar reputation. In that same confrontation between Pakistan and India last year, Beijing was actually backing the other side. It didn't matter much, though, as Indian strikes reportedly penetrated Pakistani air defenses with relative ease. Long story short, neither of their track records come with exactly really forces. And that's assuming countries would want to buy these in the first place, which is increasingly in doubt given the political costs that come with sending either Moscow or Beijing. Turkey is something of a case study here. They decided to purchase Russian S-400 systems, which led to a swift sanctioning of Ankara and got them expelled from the F-35 program back in 2019. So, if Russian and Chinese systems can't do the job, what's actually available? Well, Denmark answered that question in April by becoming the first export customer for a joint Franco-Italian system, a deal that Danish defense officials explicitly framed around US delivery timelines being too long. The system entered service this year, and its manufacturer is targeting production above 300 interceptors a year by 2028, up from somewhere around 80 to 100 in 2024. Germany's Iris-T family, which Ukraine is using, could affect the scaling too. A new facility opened in January, but roughly 3/4 of current production is going to Ukraine, which is itself delaying Germany's own build-up. So, in a small number of cases, it seems there are alternatives, but they're either untested or have even lower production levels of interceptors than American systems. Perhaps the biggest question is this: just how did the United States of all countries end up in such an unprepared situation? How the rules changed. Now, it's worth remembering that none of this used to be a crisis, even with low levels of interceptor production. It just wasn't assumed that you'd ever need a vast number of them. During the 1991 Gulf War, for example, Saddam Hussein fired the vicinity of 88 Scud missiles of Israel, Saudi Arabia, over the course of 6 weeks, and that was considered to be an extraordinary provocation. That was also the good old days. All of this stemmed from just how expensive it was to research, design, and then produce large-scale ballistic missiles that could actually reach their targets. As late as the 1990s, it was something that only a handful of countries could manage. Fast forward to today, and it's another world entirely. A single Iranian Shahed drone now costs somewhere between $20,000 and $50,000 per unit. And while there are many cheap alternatives to expensive interceptors for downing drones, as does the Ukrainians, not every country has yet invested in them, which is how we got to the fundamentally wild site of Bahrain and others using multi-million-dollar interceptors to down drones assembled for a fraction of the cost. Perhaps more relevantly, more nations are now also making at least halfway decent ballistic missiles in large numbers. The key factor here is cost. Fundamentally, it is dramatically easier to shoot something in the general direction of your enemy and hope for the best than it is to track the incoming threat, analyze the precise path it's on, calculate the needed trajectory to intercept it, and then actually launch it, all while course-correcting for variation in performance. Not for nothing though, this hasn't quite been the dramatic shift that our fast-forwarding may have made it seem. Ukraine has been at the forefront of this new type of war for 4 years now. Russia, a long-time ally of the Islamic Republic, has launched thousands of Shahed-type drones and its own cruise missiles at Ukrainian cities and infrastructure, and the interceptor maths got really ugly really fast. Fundamentally, it is just not sustainable for a military to be shooting million-dollar interceptors at $20,000 drones, and neither the US nor Europe has been able to keep pace with the resupply numbers needed. This was, of course, felt most prominently in Kiev, who were the ones actually depending on these, and as a result, they've gotten really good at their own version of counter-drone warfare. The system they've developed relies on using 3D printers to mass-produce interceptor drones that can chase down and ram a Shahed for somewhere between $1,000 and $2,000 a piece. By early 2026, Ukraine's armed forces were receiving more than 1,500 of them a day, and unlike the expensive, clunky, old-school Russian or Chinese interceptors, these boasted a success rate north of 70%. So when Operation Epic Fury began, and the Gulf was coming to terms with potentially completely running out of American ammo, Kiev was the capital they were calling. By the end of March, Zelensky was in Saudi Arabia signing 10-year defense cooperation agreements with both the Kingdom and Qatar, with the UAE being expected to follow suit. While this is a genuine breakthrough, and one both Washington and the wider world should be paying more attention to, especially given the ongoing shortages, this new approach is pretty much limited to drone attacks. For all their ingenuity, the Ukrainians haven't yet found a cheap, scalable way to stop ballistic missiles. So on that front, we're right back to square one. On the interceptor side of things, there is some hope coming out of Japan. We mentioned earlier that Mitsubishi has been building Patriots under license for years now, but post-war export restrictions meant that they couldn't actually send them anywhere. That changed when Tokyo revised the rules in late 2023, and last year saw the very first shipment arrive in the United States. It was only about 10 missiles from the bucket, but if other allied nations with the industrial capacity were able to start producing their own interceptors under a similar agreement, well, eventually it might lead somewhere. The one country that has shown true independence on this front is Israel, which spent decades and billions of dollars building the only non-American full-spectrum missile defense architecture that has held up reliably in multiple combat crises. The Iron Dome at short range, David's Sling at medium range, and Arrow at the ultra-sophisticated end. Yet even that was buckling by mid-March under the Iranian onslaught. Some estimates had Arrow down around 80%, with the IDF pressing lower-tier systems into roles they were designed for. It worked, kinda. Iranian penetration rates did climb as the war carried on, and did do significant damage in a few strikes like Dimona. Luckily, enough launchers were destroyed to end the acute phase of strikes before things got too serious. The gambling on always being able to take out your opponent's launch infrastructure before they overwhelm your air defenses is not even that was buckling by mid-March under the Iranian onslaught. Some estimates had Arrow down around 80%, with the IDF pressing lower-tier systems into roles they were designed for. It worked, kinda. Iranian penetration rates did climb as the war carried on, and did do significant damage in a few strikes like Dimona. Luckily, enough launchers were destroyed to end the acute phase of strikes before things got too serious. The gambling on always being able to take some estimates had Arrow down around 80%, with the IDF pressing lower-tier systems into roles they were designed for. It worked, kinda. Iranian penetration rates did climb as the war carried on, and did do significant damage in a few strikes like Dimona. Luckily, enough launchers were destroyed to end the acute phase of strikes before things got too serious. The gambling on always being able to take out your opponent's launch infrastructure before they overwhelm your air defenses is not a smart way to plan for conflict. For most of the last 3 decades, the countries under America's umbrella have enjoyed the luxury of treating missile defense as a given. Sometimes that just works, where if someone starts shooting at your cities, a missile getting through is the exception rather than the rule. The technology has been a blessing for much of the world as a safe countless lives. But if these interceptors run out before production lines catch up, the reality of what war really looks like is going to come crashing back down. And right now,
on the 21st of April, with only a few hours left before the ceasefire between the US and Iran expired, American President Donald Trump posted on Truth Social that he was extending it to allow discussions to happen. An inconvenient method of communication, like only at a whole meeting, and have interest in getting a deal done that stops the war, and all three have been frustrated by the IRGC in their efforts. We'll go deeper into Iran's growing internal power struggle in just a second. First, though, a quick breather to tell you about our project France.co. France.co is also...
Last month, Iraq's higher security body convened an emergency meeting in Baghdad. On the agenda, green-lighting the paramilitaries in the country to fire on American troops by all available means. Yeah, you heard that right. The government Washington installed in 2003 paid to rebuild and has spent 2 decades propping up authorized attacks on American soldiers stationed on Iraqi soil. But of course, the US isn't the only nation Iraq is dependent on. Baghdad has spent 20 years taking weapons and money from Washington while importing electricity and just about everything else from Tehran, one of the world's most delicate balancing acts that only works when those two are killing each other. 50 days into the war between the United States and Iran, this is the position Iraq is landed in. The country sits on one of the strangest geopolitical arrangements in the Middle East, and the next few weeks will determine whether that balance survives war or whether Iraq becomes the next casualty. Who's really in charge?
On the afternoon of March 24th, an emergency meeting convened at the Ministerial Council for National Security, Iraq's highest security body. The Prime Minister was there, along with the National Security Advisor, the heads of Iraq's intelligence services, and just about every other bigwig in Baghdad. Also there, though, was a rotating collection of senior figures representing the country's paramilitary forces, the armed groups that officially sit under the Iraqi state, but in practice often report to someone else, somewhere else entirely. Earlier that morning, US Israeli airstrike come down on one of their bases in Anbar province, killing 15 fighters. And the question on the agenda was how Baghdad was going to handle it. If you're thinking that they called for restraint or urged dialogue, you couldn't be more wrong. The council formally authorized Iraqi security forces, including paramilitaries, to respond to future American strikes by all available means. This was just about as broad an authorization as it could possibly provide. The firing authority got pushed straight down to individual unit commanders with no sign-off and central command required. Now take a second to let that one really sink in. The Iraqi government, the one Washington wound up creating in the aftermath of the Iraq War, have just responded to a request to target Americans on Iraqi soil by basically saying, yeah man, no worries, sure thing, you got it right. A source close to the end told the other that it's signed this under pressure from the paramilitaries themselves, which wouldn't be entirely surprising given that earlier in the month he refused to even name the groups responsible for the attacks on American targets, even as those groups were claiming the strikes on social media in real time. That directive makes a bit more sense once you understand what these paramilitary groups actually are and how much sway they have. Officially, the state recognized security institution reporting funding partially from the federal budget and the commander who reports directly to the Prime Minister. In reality, a significant portion of the funds are not to Baghdad, but to Tehran, whose Revolutionary Guard Corps is trained, funded, and in several cases directly commanded by the Iraq. When these two different theories of how they actually work into conflict, as they very much do in that room, of course, you can see which way it has to go. These networks have already been firing back even before the state officially agreed to do so. Hundreds of drone rockets right on American Kurdish targets over weeks leading up to the March 24th meeting, and with some days reporting dozens of launches. Fuad Hussein, the country's foreign minister, offered perhaps the most honest assessment of where that left Iraq in a Kurdish TV interview on March 22nd. In response to being asked whether Baghdad could control its own paramilitaries that came to it, his answer was, on the record, on camera, quoting, I don't believe so. If it becomes a matter of control leading to conflict, I don't know who holds the balance of military power. End quote. Around the same time, the spokesman for a group that had just bombed the Iraqi intelligence services, killing one, went on television accusing its Kurdish officers of being Mossad spies and singling out their director, a sitting Iraqi state official, as a foreign agent. No, this is likely all sounding a little bit wild right now. Here we are, in the midst of an on-again, off-again war with Iran, and now Iraq is claiming that it wants to join the party. How is anyone really meant to keep this stuff? But trust us when we say that this story is both important and something you can tease at least a little understanding out of. All that's really required is to grasp the basics, starting with events that took place here. Just before we jump into our story and go speeding back those 10 or so years, quick pause to let you know about our little side quest. Front.co is our subscriber-focused site. People who want to go even deeper on these kinds of stories and really get into the weeds of it all. Every week we publish 2 videos, 2 expert articles, pulling back the veil on all the conflicts shaping our world. In just the last week or so, we published first-person accounts from the frontline Ukrainian drone pilot, a deep dive into how Iran stopped a revolution among the Iranian people, and second episode, our exclusive podcast on all things Middle East. Basically, if you like this video or more of it, but even nerdier, Front.co has you covered. It's $5 a month, and you can access all sorts of exclusive content. And now, let's get into it, shall we? Ghosts of Mosul. Now, this story really starts in the summer of 2014, with one of the more dramatic collapses of the 21st century. By that time, the US-trained, US-equipped Iraqi army had been getting steadily pushed back across the country's west by fighters from the Islamic State, who had spilled over from the chaos in Syria and begun setting up their own self-governed region across the Sunni-majority provinces. Fallujah had fallen in January of that year, Ramadi was under siege by the spring, and by early June, ISIS fighters were rolling up to the gates in Mosul, Iraq's second-largest city. Now, that city was officially guarded by some 60,000 Iraqi troops and federal police who would go up against Islamic State fighters who numbered in the low thousands. The battle lasted 4 days before those 60,000 troops abandoned their positions, left behind their US-supplied Abrams tanks and Humvees, and just ran. This was just a few hours' drive from Baghdad, and nobody could stop them. Much of the blame, both then and now, including in a 2015 Iraqi parliamentary inquiry that formally recommended criminal charges, landed at the feet of one man, Nouri al-Maliki, the Iraqi prime minister at the time. He had spent his second term systematically purging non-loyalist officers from the army, stacking the senior ranks with Shia cronies whose qualifications were questionable. Meanwhile, he was running a domestic policy so transparently sectarian that it had helped to turn Iraq's Sunni provinces into recruiting pipelines for jihadists. Iraq's government, to its credit, had at least seen the collapse of Mosul coming and had requested air assistance from the United States repeatedly. But the Obama administration, still nursing the wounds of its 2011 withdrawal and dreading getting back into Iraq, declined. Iraq, though, was not hesitant. And here, they need a little reminder for this. ISIS is a catastrophic threat to the Islamic Republic. Quds Force commander Qasem Soleimani was reportedly on a flight to Baghdad within days of the Mosul collapse, offering advisors, weapons, cash, all of it with strings attached. Of course, but given the situation, the Iraqi government didn't really have much of an alternative. To help the fight, Iran leveraged its shared religious identity with the majority of Iraqis. Iraq's most senior Shia cleric, Grand Ayatollah Ali al-Sistani, issued a religious decree calling on every able-bodied Iraqi man to pick up a rifle and volunteer for the defense of the country. Tens of thousands answered the call, producing the largest military mobilization in Iraq's modern history, and given that the existing army was evaporated, this forced the government to improvise a structure capable of absorbing. What emerged was an umbrella organization called Popular Mobilization Forces, or PMF, and on paper, it looked like an emergency wartime measure. In practice, though, the structure also ended up absorbing a pre-existing network of Iranian-backed militias, groups that had spent the previous decade fighting the American occupation on Tehran's behalf. By the end of 2014, groups like Kataib Hezbollah and Asaib al-Haq, oral and dreading getting back into Iraq, declined. Iraq, though, was not hesitant. And here mainly little reminder figures. ISIS was a catastrophic threat for the Islamic Republic. Quds Force commander Qasem Soleimani was reportedly on a flight to Baghdad within days of the Mosul collapse, offering advisors, weapons, cash, all of it with strings attached. Of course, but given the situation, the Iraqi government didn't really have much of an alternative. To help the fight, Iran leveraged its shared religious identity with the majority of Iraqis. Iraq's most senior Shia cleric, Grand Ayatollah Ali al-Sistani, issued a religious decree calling on every able-bodied Iraqi man to pick up a rifle and volunteer for the defense of the country. Tens of thousands answered the call, producing the largest military mobilization in Iraq's modern history, and given that the existing army had just evaporated, this forced the government to improvise a structure capable of absorbing them. What emerged was an umbrella organization called the Popular Mobilization Forces, or PMF, and on paper, it looked like an emergency wartime measure. In practice, though, the structure also ended up absorbing a pre-existing network of Iranian-backed militias, groups that had spent the previous decade fighting the American occupation on Tehran's behalf. By the end of 2014, groups like Katyab Hezbollah and Asaib al-Ahaq had embedded themselves inside the new structure, drawing Iraqi state salaries while still taking orders from Tehran. And what makes all of this so difficult to untangle over a decade later is that the PMF actually went out and helped to win the war against ISIS, at least in Iraq. With the regular Iraqi army still in pieces, it fell to the PMF, who would later receive desperately needed air support from the US-led coalition to do the brutal house-to-house work of retaking cities like Tikrit and Fallujah. The Iraqi government eventually earned back some legitimacy by retaking Mosul itself, where thousands of their fighters died in that campaign. But by and large, when ISIS was territorially defeated in 2017, the PMF emerged as the heroes, especially among the Shia community. But even in Sunni areas that had been under Islamic State control, seeing the PMF and not the army coming to your aid was something people would never forget. Given that legacy, Baghdad couldn't just disband them. The Iraqi state's method for dealing with these guys since then has been more or less the same method it used since 2003 for every other sectarian faction in the country. Absorb them into the system, give them enough money to keep them happy, and hope that they don't cause too much trouble. In 2016, Parliament formally folded the PMF into the Iraqi security forces as an independent institution reporting to the Prime Minister. The factions got their salaries, their legal cover, and guaranteed piece of the federal budget that has since grown to $3.6 billion a year. What they didn't get, and what Baghdad never really tried to impose, was a chain of command that actually ran through Baghdad. I mean, what could go wrong with that? The world's most awkward love triangle. Well, the answer to that question of what could go wrong finally arrived on February the 28th, 2026, as American and Israeli bombs crashed down on Iran. And that made things incredibly awkward for Iraq. The structural issue here is that Iraq's two most important international partners are at this exact moment shooting at each other through Iraqi territory. The first of these partners, Iran, is Iraq's immediate neighbor, with whom it shares a 1,500-kilometer-long border. Trade between the two countries came in at roughly $12 billion in 2024, with Iraq sitting as Tehran's second largest partner after China. Given that so much of Iraq's manufacturing base was destroyed during the ISIS years and hasn't come back, this is critically important. Everything from food to construction materials to pharmaceuticals comes in from the Islamic Republic. Beyond just materials, though, Iranian energy supplies about a third of Iraq's electricity. And when Tehran turns that off, as it did multiple times in 2024 and during the opening days of the current war, entire Iraqi cities go dark. The other partner, the United States, plays an equally vital role in the country. Since 2014, Washington has funneled more than $15 billion in security assistance into Iraq, training the counterterrorism service, the only genuinely cross-sectarian elite unit in the Iraqi military, and providing air power that did a lot of heavy lifting in rolling ISIS back out of the country's north. And beyond the military side of things sits the financial architecture of it all. Iraq's government revenue comes from roughly 90% oil sales, which is done in dollars, which was first passed through an account the Iraqi central bank keeps at the Federal Reserve in New York. That arrangement gives Washington something close to a kill switch on the Iraqi economy. When the Treasury tightened the rules on how those dollars cleared, as was done repeatedly since 2022, blacklisting individual Iraqi banks and holding up specific transfers, the dinar wobbled and import prices spiked within days. Baghdad cannot afford to lose that pipeline any more than it can afford to lose the Iranian electricity that keeps half the country lit. So picking between them, not really an option. And since early March, those two partners have been actively killing each other's forces on Iraqi soil. It's a hell of an awkward love triangle, isn't it? Since the first weekend of the war, the Iran-aligned factions of the PMF have been waging what amounts to a coordinated campaign against American and Iraqi government targets from inside Iraqi territory, with attacks hitting some of the country's most important locations. Drones on Premier Air Base, where US troops are stationed, rockets on the US consulate in Erbil, a strike on Camp Victory near Baghdad. just for starters. American and Israeli fighting mob have left around 80 PMF fighters dead and over 250 wounded, with Iraqi army police and civilians killed in a crossfire. It was actually the Kurdish capital of the bill of all places, which had spent most of the post-2003 era as the country's stable area that wound up taking drone missile fire on a nearly daily basis. On April 7th, Washington and Tehran announced a 2-week ceasefire, and the Iran-aligned PMF factions followed suit a day later. Things have mostly held since then, but at the time of recording, that ceasefire is set to expire in just a few hours. And while our crystal ball still isn't allowing us to peer through the mist and see all the ways this episode might go out of date by the time we upload it, we can at least say one thing for certain. The last 6 weeks have fundamentally transformed Iraq. Baghdad was already in a weird place. After parliamentary elections last November, the country has been stuck in limbo, unable to form government. The holdup comes down to the largest bloc in parliament, solidifying around none other than Nouri al-Maliki as their chosen choice for PM. Yep, the very same al-Maliki whose previous premiership oversaw the rise of the Islamic State and the complete collapse of the Iraqi army. Sadani remains in office as a caretaker, and while he may end up getting a second term out of this, it would be through sheer lack of a viable alternative rather than any ringing endorsement of its tenure. In isolation, none of this would count as something to be proud for Baghdad, which is so chronically dysfunctional that it would make Belgium look like the paragon of calm and thoughtful governance. But right now, this political crisis is peaking at the exact moment that Iraq's two most important partners are trying to force.
Slightly more than a decade ago, the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria was at the absolute peak of its power in the Middle East. Over the following 10 years, the Islamic State's central caliphate was dismantled, its fighters were hunted down, and the world tried its very best to extinguish the ideology that had brought the jihadist proto-state into being. Mostly, that grand global effort has been a success. The Islamic State no longer holds substantial territory in most parts of the world, while governments and their militaries have shifted their attention toward more urgent problems. Even after the Islamic State lost its land, the movement never fully disappeared. It went on the ground, licked its wounds from the 2010s, and prepared for an eventual resurgence. The Islamic State of the 2020s is a very different beast. The organization has gone global. It's gone online, and it's learned to use autonomous communications, cryptocurrencies, shell corporations, and more to expand into the shadows. The organization, the world crisis, has become just a small part of the worldwide network of cells, franchises, and limited proto-states that pursue their own objectives, that coordinate and even finance each other's expansion. Today's Islamic State is a changed institution, built to thrive in a changing world. Whether it's in Africa, Asia, or the Middle East, this new version of the Islamic State is gaining ground. By all our indicators, the Islamic State franchise in the nation of Somalia, creatively dubbed the Islamic States in Somalia, or for today's state, Puntland on the easternmost tip of Somali territory, Somalia has never been a serious threat to Somali stability. After all, the group simply pales in comparison to all the other threats to Somali security, especially the much larger and more powerful jihadist insurgency, Al-Shabaab. But from their hideouts in the mountain ranges of secluded Puntland, Somalia spent the first few years of the 2020s evolving into something more. They took over villages, captured lucrative gold mines, and created other sources of income for their movement, but instead of expanding their territory any further, they focused on becoming the nexus of the global Islamic State movement. They created elaborate transnational funding networks, created propaganda for affiliates to post worldwide, and even welcomed some of the most senior Islamic State leaders from across the globe. High in the mountains, in an ignored autonomous region of a nation that had far bigger problems, Somalia could do as it pleased in relative safety. But starting in late 2024, Somalia came under relentless attack, not just by the armed forces of the Puntland region, but from barrage after barrage of US air power. By the start of 2026, the Islamic State in Somalia was in total disarray, and their former base of operations had been torn apart. For that reason, most observers of the global Islamic State movement were very surprised to see an announcement by Moroccan intelligence on the 25th of March 2026. On that day, several months after Somalia was thought to have been basically dismantled, Morocco's General Directorate of Territorial Surveillance, or DGSD, announced that it had dismantled an Somalia terror cell on its soil. Working together with Spanish intelligence, Morocco learned about an Somalia cell operating out of Tangier and Mallorca. That cell had been coordinating financing and logistical support for multiple Islamic State franchises across Africa, including in Somalia, but their ambitions had gone far beyond that. According to Moroccan intelligence, the cell was also plotting an imminent attack, not in Morocco or anywhere in Africa, but in Spain. Making the discovery all the stranger, the Somalia cell was reportedly working with representatives from another Islamic State franchise, the powerful Sahel, operating across the Sahel region of Africa just south of the Sahara. It was the latest sign of the Sahel franchise's growing ambition, as the group turns its attention from its goals of fighting force in Africa and starts to entertain the prospect of going global. The unexpected cell in Morocco was announced just one day after another unusual revelation, this time from the Africa Defense Forum. On the 24th of March, the ADF released a report on the Islamic State's expansion into the country of Libya. While Libya was a hotbed of Islamic State insurgency during the mid-2010s, the group was thought to have shifted its attention elsewhere long ago. Quoting extremism researcher Aaron Zellin, the Islamic State has been quiet in Libya for almost a decade. According to the ADF report, the Islamic State has rebuilt itself all across the divided nation in areas controlled by the internationally recognized Libyan government and in areas controlled by the powerful warlord Khalifa Haftar. As the ADF describes it, the Islamic State has been getting very cozy with the human trafficking networks that operate all across Libya, funneling migrants from sub-Saharan Africa toward perilous Mediterranean crossings. In the southern part of Libya, particularly in a region known as Fezzan, the Islamic State has also been able to link itself to transnational networks that run all across the region, from war-torn Sudan to unstable Chad to the embattled military regimes in Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso. As a Libyan analyst, Abdel Abdel-Kafi told a Lebanese outlet called An-Nahar, the Islamic State has been waiting for a moment like this in Libya for the past several years. As tensions between Libya's two rival factions have continued to rise, Libyan intelligence has started to encounter resurgent Islamic State cells with growing frequency, first recruiting fighters and sending them to Somalia and the Sahel, then laundering money, and then operating shell corporations disguised as humanitarian groups. In August of 2025, Libyan intelligence reportedly dismantled a cell that had come into possession of mortars, anti-aircraft guns, lots of ammunition, and a cross-border financial network that used cryptocurrency exchanges to transfer cash. Each of those two reports came on the heels of the third investigation into Islamic State expansion, this time via conflict analyst Powell Wojcik, who, by the way, you can read on our very own website, funds.co. This particular report, however, was published by the Jamestown Foundation and highlighted the Islamic State's growing presence in northern Azerbaijan. As Wojcik describes, the Islamic State is a relatively new arrival to Azerbaijan, only formalizing a new franchise there in 2024. But over the last several months, Islamic State cells have been intercepted in the planning stages ahead of multiple attacks, including a plan to attack the Israeli embassy in the capital city of Baku. For the Islamic State, Azerbaijan is a particularly interesting place to set up shop for several reasons. Not only does the country struggle to track down and curtail other extremist networks on its soil, but it's a hotbed for illicit weapons trafficking, and it's a very convenient base of operations to recruit potential fighters from across the Caucasus region. This is a place where jihadist ideology is known to be relatively common in Sunni Muslim communities compared to other Sunni communities across the globe. From Morocco to Libya to Azerbaijan, these reports all suggest a concerning trend that even though the Islamic State isn't capturing global headlines, it's in a quiet but organised period of expansion to new areas. But before we break down what that means for the rest of the world, we'd like to take a moment to discuss Front.co, our team's premium website, visiting news outlet, and one-stop shop for global conflict analysis. On Fronts, our team works with award-winning journalists and experts who provide key insights into the wars, flashpoints, and geopolitics that shape our world. Plus, we provide exclusive video episodes every single week as well as our briefing room, a Saturday collection of under-the-radar stories from across the globe. Also on Fronts, we provide multiple free offerings each week, including our twice-weekly newsletter on world conflicts. Best of all, Front.co costs just $5 a month or $50 a year. You check out the site, subscribe if you like what you see, and now, back to the global Islamic State. At this point, we'd like to offer what we suspect will be a relatively controversial claim. If the global Islamic State organization is in a period of expansion, then that would be really bad news for, well, the entire world, beyond the Islamic State members themselves. Now, if the three examples that we shared already were the entirety of the evidence that the Islamic State was expanding, they would be more than a little bit overzealous for us to draw that conclusion. After all, most Islamic State insurgents across the globe are not located in Libya or Morocco or Azerbaijan, and if the group were making limited gains while being beaten back everywhere else, then on balance we might conclude that the group's influence and power are shrinking. Unfortunately, though, that isn't the case. To get a sense of the larger problem, we'll turn to the Middle East, where a recent headline by the outlet War on the Rocks phrased it best: Islamic State containment is collapsing in Syria. As War on the Rocks explains, and as a small but vocal group of conflict analysts have been trying to explain to the world for more than a year now, the Islamic State has gained critical opportunity to act in Syria after the December 2024 collapse of the Assad regime. To be clear, the Islamic State's new opportunity was not inevitable. Instead, it's the result of security failures, strategic miscalculations, infighting, and foreign interference in post-Assad Syria, often with zero regard for the security threat posed by the Islamic State. Most recently and most importantly, the new Syrian transitional leadership has basically dismantled the autonomous Kurdish-led government that once ruled in the Syrian northeast. That decision has actually caused a long and growing list of problems all across Syria and the wider region, but the biggest problem is this. Opportunity was not inevitable. Instead, it's the result of security failures, strategic miscalculations, infighting, and foreign interference in post-Assad Syria, often with zero regard for the security threat to explain a larger problem. We'll turn to the Middle East, where a recent headline by the outlet War on the Rocks phrased it best: Islamic State containment is collapsing in Syria. As War on the Rocks explains, and as a small but vocal group of conflict analysts have been trying to explain to the world for more than a year now, the Islamic State has gained a critical opportunity to act in Syria after the December 2024 collapse of the Assad regime. To be clear, the Islamic State's new opportunity was not inevitable. Instead, it's the result of security failures, strategic miscalculations, infighting, and foreign interference in post-Assad Syria, often with zero regard for the security threat posed by the Islamic State. Most recently and most importantly, the new Syrian transitional leadership has basically dismantled the autonomous Kurdish-led government that once ruled in the Syrian northeast. That decision has actually caused a long and growing list of regard for the security threat posed by the Islamic State. Most recently and most importantly, the new Syrian transitional leadership has basically dismantled the autonomous Kurdish-led government that once ruled in the Syrian northeast. That decision has actually caused a long and growing list of problems all across Syria and the wider region, but the biggest problem is this. The Kurdish-led government and its paramilitary, the Syrian Democratic Forces, were charged with keeping control over massive refugee camps that held thousands of Islamic State fighters and families. But when Damascus launched its military offensive to recapture the Syrian northeast, those Kurdish forces were left unable to protect those camps, and despite limited intervention from the United States to try and ferry Islamic State detainees to Iraq, the results were catastrophic. Prior to the Syrian offensive, the largest camp in this area, known as Al-Hol, was home to roughly 24,000 people, mostly women and children, with links to the Islamic State. But when the Syrian Democratic Forces were forced to pull back with no way to hand off competent oversight to the incoming military, Al-Hol was the site of a mass escape. According to US intelligence officials who spoke with the Wall Street Journal, thousands upon thousands of Islamic State family members were able to break out of the camp and disappear, leading American intelligence to conclude that as many as 20,000 former detainees were now at large across Syria. Quoting the journal, security experts have long warned that the wives of Islamic State fighters were effectively raising the next generation of militants at the sprawling Al-Hol facility. Now, to be clear, the story here is not that Syria's transitional leadership simply decided to let these people run free. Say what you will about the leadership in Damascus today, and there is plenty to say, but the former jihadists who rule Syria right now really despise the Islamic State. Instead, the escapes seem to have been the result of complete and utter mismanagement of the transition of camp authority. Both Damascus and the Syrian Democratic Forces are pointing fingers at each other for causing the breakout. Either way, those Islamic State loyalists have escaped into Syria at a really bad time from the rest of the world's perspective. The organization has already taken full advantage of the security vacuum that the fall of the regime had caused, as well as the political instability, the sectarian infighting, and the other problems that have beset the Syrian transition process. The Islamic State in Syria clearly understands that if they were to use that security vacuum to capture territory, it would risk unifying Damascus and its many internal enemies to deal with the only insurgent threat that all of them despise enough to find a way to work together. Instead, the Islamic State is taking advantage of the fact that as long as they don't draw attention to themselves, Syrian leadership is much too distracted to pay them any attention. Even better, the United States is pulling out of Syria at the same time, and their withdrawal will probably conclude on schedule as long as the Islamic State doesn't give Washington reason to change its mind. As War on the Rocks explains, quote, "This is creating a permissive environment for radicalization that the Islamic State can exploit to infiltrate state structures and rebuild networks. Washington's mission against the Islamic State is ending at the very moment the group is poised to resurge." End quote. The ongoing war in Iran and the Middle East chaos and instability that have come with it have only made the Islamic State's job easier. Meanwhile, in Africa, other Islamic State franchises are gaining ground. The Islamic State Sahel province is rapidly accumulating power, operating across Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, and other Sahel nations where the majority of global terrorism deaths now take place. IS Sahel isn't the most dangerous terror insurgency in the area. Instead, that dubious honor goes to Janim, an Al-Qaeda affiliate. But Janim has created a level of pandemonium that's cleared the way for IS Sahel to expand its own operations, positioning itself as an even more radical, even more ruthless fighting force for locals who don't believe that Janim goes far enough. Back in January, IS Sahel used drones and mortars to assault a key international airport in Niger, in a stunning display of the group's growing capabilities. In Nigeria and other nearby nations, the Islamic State West Africa province, or ISWAP, has been able to engage government forces in larger and larger battles, even as it fights for dominance against other jihadist insurgency, Boko Haram. In the Democratic Republic of the Congo, several eastern provinces have been destabilized by an Islamic State-affiliated group called the Allied Democratic Forces, which, we should clarify, are neither democratic nor allied with anybody except the Islamic State itself. While the Allied Democratic Forces have operated in massive roving bands across the country for years, they've become increasingly brazen over the last few months. In an especially notable attack, the group stormed a Chinese-run gold mine, killing several local miners and causing the Chinese nationals in charge of the site to flee for their safety. Even in the war-torn Congo, attacks on Chinese interests are still relatively rare, and this latest attack suggests that the Islamic State's Congolese partners are becoming interested in the foreign operations that extract lucrative resources from their country. Finally, the outbreak of two major conflicts in Asia has opened the door for one of the Islamic State's most dangerous franchises, IS Khorasan, to rapidly expand its power and influence. IS Khorasan is active across Pakistan, Uzbekistan, Afghanistan, and Tajikistan, and if you've kept up with global politics for the past couple of months, then you are aware that two of those four nations are currently at war. Since late February, Pakistan and Afghanistan have engaged in battles that have been overshadowed by the war in Iran. Those battles are taking place in the border region between the two countries, where IS Khorasan is historically at its strongest, but the Islamic State has mostly stayed out of the conflict. Instead, the group appears to be exploiting the instability to expand its operations, recruit new members, and attract defectors from the Pakistani Taliban and other insurgent groups whose members come seeking an even more hardline movement to be a part of. Just as important, IS Khorasan appears poised to capitalize on the ongoing war in Iran. Quoting intelligence researcher Morgan Tadich, writing for the Atlantic Council, ISIS seem poised to exploit this moment of regional instability to its advantage. Specifically, ISIS appears eager to attract new followers, inspire attacks, and consolidate territory amid the chaos caused by the Iran war and by the security situations in Syria and Afghanistan. And we should just note here that in this case, the acronym ISIS there appears to be a stand-in for the entire Islamic State movement. Right now, the entire world is going through a period of upheaval, and it's hardly a surprise that the Islamic State has faded out of the headlines. And that's by design. After all, the Islamic State has learned its lessons from its attempt to form a caliphate in the 2010s, and it's shifted to become a transcontinental insurgency that thrives when it's being ignored. But periods of worldwide chaos, where governments, militaries, intelligence agencies, and media outlets shift their focus elsewhere, are exactly the moments when a quiet, well-coordinated insurgency like the Islamic State can exploit its window of opportunity. We don't get to present a comprehensive overview of the Islamic State's recent gains, like we would in our coverage of the war in Iran or any number of other crises across the globe. The Islamic State has grown up from its hot-head adolescent years into a mature, well-connected, and extremely dangerous insurgency that fully understands the value of secrecy. Tracking the Islamic State is like staring at a lake and trying to tell what's going on underwater by tracking the occasional waves and ripples on the surface. But whatever news does come out about the Islamic State, the conclusions are the same. At a time of chaos all across the globe, the Islamic State is gaining in power, expanding its ambitions, and setting up new cells in new places with a focus on new targets. Worst of all, the organization knows that the rest of the world is looking away. By the time that changes, the Islamic State will have covered its tracks, and whatever plans it will have developed by that time will be more difficult than ever to expose. Thank you for watching.
I never felt like the American support was genuine. These were words of Kurdish activist Hebi Ahmed, who, in an interview with France captured the profound sense of betrayal among Syria's Kurdish population after it was proven to be a bruising start of the year, because at one point Washington's most important partner in the fight against ISIS had clashed with the Syrian
shell corporations and more to expand. Al-Hol was the site of a mass escape. According to people, mostly women. And despite limited intervention from the United States to try and ferry Islamic State detainees, the largest camp, the results were catastrophic. Prior to the Syrian offensive, the largest camp in this area, democratic Kurdish-led government, and most importantly, the new Syrian transitional leadership has basically dismantled the autonomous Kurdish-led government that once ruled in the Syrian northeast. That decision has actually caused a long and growing list of problems all across Syria and the wider region, but the biggest problem is this. The Kurdish-led government and its paramilitary, the Syrian Democratic Forces, were charged with keeping control of a massive refugee military offensive to recapture the Islamic State fighters and families. But when Damascus launched its military offensive to recapture the Syrian northeast, those Kurdish forces were left unable to protect those camps, and despite limited intervention from the United States to try and ferry Islamic State detainees to Iraq, the results were catastrophic. Prior to the Syrian offensive, the largest camp in this area, known were catastrophic. Prior to the Syrian offensive, the largest letters were forced to pull back with no way to hand off combat. Leaders were able to break out of the camp and disappear. These were now the wives of Islamic State whole facility. Now, to be clear, the story here is not that Syria's transitional leadership simply decided to let these people run free. Say what you will about the leadership in Damascus today, and there is plenty to say, but the former jihadists who rule Syria right now really despise the Islamic State. To rule Syria right now really despise the Islamic State. Instead, the escapes seem to have been the result of complete and utter mismanagement of the transition of authority. Both Damascus and the Syrian Democratic Forces are pointing fingers at each other for causing the breakouts. From the world's perspective, the organization has already escaped into Syria at a really bad time. From the rest of the world's perspective, the organization has already taken full advantage of the security vacuum infighting fall of the regime had caused, as well as the political instability, the Islamic State territory in the insurgent taking advantage of them any attention. Even better, the United States is pulling out of Syria. Leadership is much too distracted to pay them any attention. Even better, the United States is pulling out of Syria at the same time, and their withdrawal will probably conclude on schedule as long as this is create structure and the easier. Meanwhile, in nating power, other Islamic states have gaining ground. The Islamic State's job easier. Meanwhile, in Africa, other Islamic State franchises gaining ground. The Islamic State's job easier. Meanwhile, in Africa, other Islamic State franchises gaining ground. Burkina Faso and other Sahel nations where the majority of the area. Instead, that dubious honor goes to Jenim, an Al-Qaeda affiliate. But Jenim has created a level of pandemonium that's cleared the way for ISL to expand its own operations.
I would like to extend a heartfelt welcome to you all. Throughout the day, you will participate in several games. The winner of all games will receive a prize. We wish you luck.
Positioning itself as an even more radical, even more ruthless fighting force for locals who don't believe that Jenim goes far enough. Back in January, ISL used drones and mortars to assault a key area airport in Niger. Enough. Back in January, ISL used drones and mortars to assault a key international airport in Niger, in a stunning display of the group's growing capabilities. In Nigeria and other nearby nations, the Islamic State West Africa province, or ISWAP, has been able to engage government forces in larger and larger battles, even as it fights for dominance against other jihadist insurgency, Boko Haram. In the Democratic Republic of the Congo, several eastern provinces have been destabilized by an Islamic State-affiliated group called the Allied Democratic Forces, which, we should clarify, are neither democratic nor allied with anybody, proving notable Chinese national attacks on nationals in charge of the site to flee for their safety, killing several local miners and causing the Chinese nationals in charge of the site to flee for their safety. Even in the war-torn Congo, attacks on Chinese interests are still relatively rare, and become finally this franchise active across Pakistan, Uzbekistan to rapidly expand its power and influence. IS Khorasan is active across Pakistan, Uzbekistan, Afghanistan. Two of those four nations are currently at war. Since those battles, it's exploiting but the Islamic State has mostly stayed out of the conflict. Instead, the group appears to be exploiting from the Pakistani Taliban and other insurgent groups whose members come seeking an even more hardline movement to be a part of. Just as important, IS Khorasan appears poised to capitalize on the ongoing war in Iran. Quoting intelligence researcher Morgan Tadich, writing for the Atlantic Council, ISIS seem poised to exploit this moment of regional instability and of upheaval, Islamic State. And we should just note here that in this case the acronym ISIS there appears to be a stand-in for the entire Islamic State movement. Right now, the entire world is going through a period of upheaval, and it's hardly a surprise state has trans-world where it can enter lessons when it's faded out of the headlines. And that's by design. After all, the Islamic State has learned its lessons from its attempt to fall the caliphate in the 20s, when it's being media outlets shift their focus. Periods of worldwide chaos, where governments, militaries, intelligence agencies, and media outlets. But periods of worldwide chaos, where governments, militaries, intelligence agencies and media outlets shift their focus elsewhere, are exactly the moments when a quiet, well-coordinated insurgency like the Islamic State can exploit its window of opportunity. We don't get to present a comprehensive number of other crises across the globe, like we would not coverage of the war in Iran or any number of other crises across the globe. The Islamic State is extremely dangerous insert, staring at waves and ripples to tell what's going on underwater by tracking the occasional waves and ripples to tell what's going on underwater by tracking the occasional waves and ripples. But setting up the organization will efficient cells in new places with a focus on new targets. Worst of all, the organization cells in new places with a power, expanding its ambitions and setting up new cells in places with a focus on new targets. Worst of all, the organization knows that the rest of the world is looking away. By the time that changes, the Islamic State will cover its tracks, and whatever plans it will have developed by that time will be more difficult than ever to expose. Thank you for watching.
I never felt like the American support was genuine. These were words of Kurdish activist Heavy Ahmed, who, in an interview with France, captured the profound sense of betrayal among Syria's Kurdish population, often proved to be a bruising start of the year. The Kurds, at one point Washington's most important partner in the fight against ISIS, and clashed with the Syrian.
Our hall was the site of a mass escape. According to the context, despite limited intervention from the United States, Foreign Carry Islamic State detected the largest the results catastrophic. Out of the Syrian offensive, the largest camp in this area. Most importantly, the new Syrian transitional leadership is basically dismantled the Hamas Kurdish regime for one of Europe's peace. And that decision has actually caused prolonged and very risky inspection of the coast and the wider region. The biggest problem
Washington's most important partner in the fight against bounds.
adolescent years understands trying to tell the time of chaos what's going on underwater by tracking the occasional waves of its ambitions and setting up new cells knows in new places with a focus on new targets. Worst of all, the organization knows that the rest of the world is looking away. By the time that changes, the Islamic State will have covered its tracks, the rest, and whatever plan away. By the time that changes, the Islamic State will have covered its tracks, and whatever plans it will have developed by that time changes, the Islamic State will have covered its tracks, and whatever plans it will have developed by that time will be more difficult than ever to expose. Thank you for watching.
I never felt like the American support was genuine. These were words of Kurdish activist Heavy Ahmed, who, in an interview, was genuine. These were words of Kurdish activist Heavy Ahmed, who who in an interview with was genuine. These were words of Kurdish activist Heavy Ahmed, who in an interview was genuine. These were words of Kurdish activist Heavy Ahmed, who in an interview with France